A week after starting, the trial of Christopher Schurr is nearing an end. Closing arguments happened this afternoon, and the jury is now deliberating.
Schurr, a former Grand Rapids police officer, is charged with second-degree murder in the death of Patrick Lyoya 3 years ago.
We have multiple crews covering this story today, beginning with Callie Lichter and the prosecution's closing arguments. Callie.
Elena, Juliet, before I get into that, if you hear or see anything behind me, that's because all we hear at the Kent County Courthouse, there's been two distinct groups of demonstrators, one in support of Patrick Lyoya and another in support of Christopher Schurr. But when it comes to the prosecution's closing argument, they started it the same way they started the trial off, by driving home the seriousness of the case that led those 14 members to the jury box. As the trial comes to a close, Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker reiterated to the jury what the state has been arguing for the past 3 years.
When he fired the shot, he intended to kill. That is clear when you put a bullet in the back of somebody's head.
The prosecution's belief that this was an intentional, unjustifiable killing. At the beginning of the nearly 30-minute closing argument, Becker asks the jury to not become numb to seeing the video of the incident over and over.
It wasn't TV, it's not movies. This is a real man. Human being who was shot in the back of the head back in April of 2022. We watched it over and over.
He says just because Lyoya had the taser did not mean he needed to die.
No evidence, no evidence, never said he threatened it, said he was going to use it, that I was going to kill you, said anything like that. He simply had the taser as one of the justifications of why I had to shoot.
He recognizes Lyoya wasn't a perfect man.
Because Patrick is no saint. I'm not going to sit here and argue Patrick was a saint. He was drunk driving. He was resisting. He was driving without a driver's license. None of those are executable offenses.
But he believes no actions taken that day by Lyoya justified the outcome. He referenced Christopher Schurr's statement to the Michigan State Police days after the shooting, where Schurr said Lyoya was trying to get away.
That's the defendant's perspective.
Closing his argument, he asks the jury what from this traffic stop would lead to a justifiable shooting.
This is a traffic stop. At the time the defendant knew what was going on. It was for a bad plate and no driver's license. What out of all this, we didn't think he was going to die?
The prosecution got a chance at a rebuttal after the defense's closing argument, where Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker touched on what he believes is the hypocrisy of some of the defense's witnesses and the voluntary manslaughter charge, which was just introduced today at the Kent County Courthouse. I'm Callie Lichter, 13 on your side.
The defense followed the prosecution, reviewing the evidence and trying to poke holes in the prosecution's case.
Schurr's attorney tried to convince the jury one last time his client killed Patrick Lyoya because he feared for his life.
13 on your side's Joshua Albertus is also live in downtown Grand Rapids and joins us now with that part of the story.
Yeah, where you just heard from the prosecution guys, as in a case like this, it's up to the prosecution. They have the burden of proof for a conviction. So this was essentially the defense's last arguments, arguing that the evidence as it was presented in this case did not meet a conviction and that the prosecution did not successfully prove all the elements for a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt.
That's it. That's how much time he's got to make up his mind. That's what you're judging him on.
Closing arguments for the defense in the trial of former Grand Rapids police officer Christopher Schurr, charged with murder in the death of Patrick Lyoya. Attorney Matt Borgula addressing the jury in defense of his client. Borgula arguing the prosecution had attempted to make the case something it was not.
You are not here to judge the GRPD policy. You are not here to judge whether it was reasonable for him to chase Patrick Lyoya.
Rather, he argued, it was another piece that fell to the 12 people who will decide Schurr's fate.
You have to decide whether the prosecutor has proven beyond a reasonable doubt, whether Grand Rapids Police Department Officer Christopher Schurr had a reasonable fear of great bodily harm or death.
Borgula also addressing past testimony from the prosecution's witnesses. In his view, they opened the door for reasonable doubt.
They're disagreeing with each other on the basis for why he should or should not be in fear. How can you convict someone for acting unreasonably and not being in fear? when their own experts disagree. And certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt.
While experts had spoken to generally accepted practices, Borgula further arguing the jury should deeply consider this officer's training.
Why is this relevant? Because you're considering the knowledge of the officer, not generally accepted police practices. They may coincide from time to time, but you're looking at what, he's a street cop. He's trained.
The moment Schurr had a decision to make. And whether the prosecution had proved what he did was unreasonable beyond a reasonable doubt was what the defense argued this case was about. And now that those closing arguments have concluded, we will be awaiting a verdict and will be bringing you the latest as it develops. For now, outside the courthouse, Josh Albertus, 13 on your side.
Josh, thank you. And just before deliberation, the prosecution introduced a new charge to the jury. 13 Your Side's Riley Mack joins us live in front of the courthouse with what that could mean for the defense. Riley.
Elena and Juliet, the prosecution introduced a new charge, that charge of voluntary manslaughter. This is a lesser charge that could carry a potential sentence of up to 15 years. Voluntary manslaughter is when a person kills in the heat of the moment out of a sudden outburst of emotion and does not initially set out on committing a crime. In these cases, there isn't sufficient time between the provocation and the killing for a reasonable person to calm down and regain control. In their closing arguments, both sides clashed over the charge's introductions.
The traditional manslaughter thing is when a spouse shows up and sees their spouse in bed and loses it. That's your typical manslaughter. You lose it and they want to kill them. It's not, well, they got into a fight. A manslaughter instruction is because of emotional excitement. Because of emotional excitement, somebody who's driven to kill somebody. That's what we're talking about here.
Officer, he got up there and he told you, yeah, I intended to use deadly force. I intended to shoot him. But it was justified because he had the taser and I was in fear.
His thinking must be.
Though the defense attorney initially objected to including that charge, Judge Christina Mims ultimately allowed it, and now it's up to those 12 jury members who just got sent home for the day to decide what charges, if any, apply best to that April 4th morning. Live in Grand Rapids, I'm Riley Mack.
And again, a manslaughter conviction is now that possible outcome in this trial, but that is one of several the jury can decide. 13 on your side's Lauren Baker joins us now with the other possible outcomes of this trial. Lauren.
Juliet, there are possibly 4 different outcomes in this trial. We could see Schurr convicted of second-degree murder, convicted of voluntary manslaughter, found innocent, or we could have a hung jury. The majority of this trial has focused on the second-degree murder charge or the acquittal of Schurr. And just recently, voluntary manslaughter came into play, but there is always a possibility that this case could end up with a hung jury. What that basically means is that the jury could not come to a unanimous conclusion of whether or not Schurr is guilty. Attorney Tanya Krause-Phelan says that only happens if the jury is in a true deadlock and there is no way to know how long the jury will deliberate.
There's no way to know how long the jurors will deliberate. Jurors might come back really quickly, or they might take several days to go through this. And if at some point during the deliberations, the jurors can't reach a consensus, they may actually come out to the judge and say, hey, we're split, we can't agree. And judges normally, the first time a jury does that, in any case, the judge usually will say, hey, we get that this is difficult, but you heard the testimony, you saw the evidence, it's your responsibility to go back and continue deliberating with respect and due diligence and try to reach a verdict.
And if the judge declares a mistrial because of a hung jury, the prosecution would decide whether or not if they want to go forward with a second trial. If they don't want to do that, they could offer plea agreements to a reduce of charges. In the newsroom, Lauren Baker, 13 on your side.
And stay with 13 on your side because we are ready for the verdict when it comes in. We will carry it live on our air and on our streaming app, 13 Plus. We'll also have expert reaction. We'll hear from the community as well. You can also re-watch the entire trial on demand on 13 Plus. You can download it on your TV and watch for free.